Women as Experts.
We talk a lot about diversity, equity, and inclusivity, but talking about it and finding the people that represent our community are, as we know, two different things. And I think we all get a little bit lazy, including the media, in terms of the people that we go to find out answers or to, I know this person is going to be available to come on the radio this morning, and so we'll just ask them to do this. I think that it's really incumbent on everybody to do a little digging and find people, because we know there are qualified people out there that have expert opinions on a lot of different things that don't have to be all male and they don't have to be white. And I think we can put a real intersectional lens on that. And it's just going to take some work. The deal is, though, once you've found those people, then you've got a much more diverse pool of people from which you can draw and get the different opinions. Because no matter what, we all view the world through the eyes that we're looking at in our own experiences. And that's what we bring to the table. And so everything that comes in, we perceive it through our lens and our experiences. You can't tell me that everybody has the same viewpoint on things, and especially if they haven't experienced it. I mean, how many times have we been in conversations where you're talking to a guy about something and it's, well, I don't think that's right. Well, right, because you didn't experience it.
In 2020, the International Women's Media Foundation released 2 studies authored by Luba Kasova entitled The Missing Perspectives of Women in News. Both reports discussed several issues related to gender equality in news coverage, including the representation, or lack thereof, of women as experts. The first report was more specific to COVID-19 news, and the second, released 2 months later, was broader in nature for discussion of these issues. In the studies from the International Women's Media Foundation, it was found that media featured men as experts and commentators about COVID-19 news 4 times more frequently than they featured women. It is suggested that one of the reasons for this underrepresentation of women is that status quo bias results in journalists relying on established sources who are much more likely to be men than women.
That for the most part, especially for journalists rushing to get stories, they tend to go with who they know, go with their networks. And who we know is predicated generally on people who are like us, and who will give the quotes very quickly and who has the information. And you're going to have to go beyond the quote unquote mainstream, whatever that might be for a certain issue. And you're going to have to find those experts. And they're out there. Clearly, it takes more time. It means you have to start cultivating those connections. And it may be uncomfortable because you're having to go beyond those that you know.
In the broader report from the International Women's Media Foundation on women's representation in the news, it was found that the expertise of women has historically been marginalized and undervalued, and that in the 10-year time period between 2005 and 2015, less than 20% of experts or commentators involved in news coverage were women. This underrepresentation is most pronounced in television news and newspapers. In her book, Fixed It, Jane Gilmore finds that less than 1/4 of news stories broadcast or written include women, and women are fewer than 15% of quoted experts.
I think there has been more emphasis on that in recent years than when I first started, especially since the Black Lives Matters and Me Too and the Indigenous residential schools. There has been more of an emphasis of trying to get diverse voices into the paper. The experts you have are the experts you have sometimes. So if you need to talk to somebody on a board and every member of the board is a white male, then that's who you're left with, right? If you want to talk to a female politician, the numbers are a lot smaller in Niagara than the male politicians. So we try and reach out sometimes, but it just sometimes depends, too, on who is in your community. Our emphasis at our paper is to talk to local experts if you can, as opposed to calling somebody in Toronto or BC or something like that. So you can try, but it doesn't always work out the way that you're hoping.
While women are overrepresented in telling stories as homemakers, students, and parents, they continue to be underrepresented in political news coverage in comparison to their actual numbers in political positions. Multiple academic studies, using a variety of methodologies, have consistently found that women are substantially underrepresented in news coverage, especially in newspapers.
White heterosexual men are taken seriously in this society in this current day and age. Then it's white men, and then white women, and then men of color. And so there's a hierarchy that we're not talking about in terms of who's taken seriously and who isn't. It's such a different paradigm, Laura. I'm not unusual in my community for my strength or my leadership, because that was expected in my culture of our women. We've been leading for a very long time, and we're taken seriously in our healthy Indigenous communities by the men in our community, and they don't struggle with the leadership issues. They don't. In the non-Indigenous world, I need to be nice. I should have said it kinder. Or the amazement that I have intelligence. The awe of my being articulate. Which blows my mind. When I speak, people often refer to my passion. They can see that I'm passionate about a topic. I don't know what that actually means, though, in the non-Indigenous world. It seems to be somewhat of a neutral, which is okay. But I could find out in 5 years that it was yet another way to dismiss. Because if is that too much emotion? Is that not enough emotion? The fact that I even have to think about that is mind-blowing, let alone for my Indigenous sisters who sometimes don't have all of this. They're too much dealing with life and the issues of being marginalized to be able to give a moment's thought, and raising kids, holding jobs, getting an education, doing all the things that life requires.
Even in the case of news coverage related to gender equality, men are more likely to be featured in stories than women. If this continues to be true, and if gender equality issues are not truly front of mind for journalists, other opinion formers, or decision makers, when we know how critical the media is in forming public opinion and influencing public policy, then we face an enormous obstacle in ever achieving true gender equality. We are not seeing journalists connect gender equality issues to issues that are of public concern. They are not considering how issues might impact women differently than they impact men. In her book, Invisible Women, Carolyn Criado Perez provides numerous examples of issues that we do not commonly think of as gender issues. For instance, Criado Perez points out that snow clearing is a gender issue and that prioritizing clearing roads over clearing sidewalks disproportionately impacts women and drives up healthcare costs for women because women are more likely than men to be pedestrians, and pedestrians are 3 times more likely than motorists to suffer injuries due to icy conditions. If journalists and editors use a gender lens to analyze and report all stories, it is highly likely that they will find ways to report the stories that improve gender equality, or at least bring more attention to it, including if the people they speak to about these issues are women. Even better if, in the case of snow clearing as a gender issue, for instance, they are speaking with women engineers and planners. Several studies have found that journalistic sourcing is biased toward a narrow range of sources who are most likely to be middle-aged, middle-class, and predominantly white men. When asked, some media folks indicated that this was because they would be looking for the foremost expert on a topic. Of course, given the continued challenges with the representation of women and racially marginalized people in senior leadership roles, it would be uncommon to find anyone other than white men in these senior leadership roles.
The first thing is that there has to be recognition that not everybody is equally portrayed in the media and not given a voice in media stories. This is an important conversation that we're having society-wide, and I think that the more effort that we put into finding those voices, the better stories we're going to have. I know for myself on council, if someone's talking about an issue and they come in and maybe it's a person of color who comes in and explains their relationship to whatever issue we're talking about, I'm the richer for hearing their opinions. I can hear something different that I may not have thought about, or my lived experience has not brought me to that point. If that voice isn't there, I don't have the ability to learn from that. So I think in media stories, whatever the topic might be, including these voices, making sure we're going to other people is vital. The other question I would ask is, what's an expert, right? Who are we determining our experts? Is it someone, PhD is an expert on these topics all the time? Does it have to be like that? Maybe someone who sits on our equity and inclusion committee at the city could talk about these ideas rather than me, right? Like someone is probably better suited to talk about, if you wanted to do a story about equity inclusion, someone who actually sits on that committee than me, who just reads the minutes and approves other things at council. So it's doing the work, right? I guess it's just doing the work, that which is sometimes hard.
We're looking for someone with a PhD in a subject may be very different to someone who has the lived experience and can speak to it in a way that is actually going to get the story across very differently. And I think that that's, we get a lot of talking heads in the media, and they have studied a subject for 20 years. But it's very different if we're talking about equity, inclusion topics, if compared to someone who's lived it and it has studied it as well. And that grouping is growing. So there's more and more individuals who are working within their own communities and who can speak to a subject with far greater authority, but they may not be as well known. They may not have the name recognition. They may not be so easy to contact. They may be incredibly busy. So how do you ahead of time broaden that list of contacts? How in a newsroom is the listing of those people available as broad as possible? And also, I think that we have to think about the ways that people tell their stories. And so if you're looking for a 30-second clip and you want this 3 perfect sentences, then I think media will avoid somebody who's going to tell the story in their own way, who prefaces it by providing context and background, all of which is so important, but it's not going to fit in a 30-second clip. And I think that that's another problem with people, getting news. It's all in these clips. And then what's repeated on the news are those same clips from the same people. And so it's a self-perpetuating cycle until we decide to move out and say, actually, we need 10 minutes to talk about this because we're going to have an elder describe this, and they're going to provide a context that goes back 500 years. And we need that. And in the telling, they'll get to that point.
So including our comments is really important. It just doesn't always hit. The Heather Winterstein story, which is current and happened in December of last year, so it's still new. It's because we could reach out to the media and elevate that story as publicly interesting and important to our community if we're going to produce systems change. That would not have been possible, when I started at the Friendship Center, where they wanted more to know about the puff pieces around me. But everything from national stories to provincial stories to regional stories, to have to stay on top of that. I think what media doesn't understand is, heck, I do like to sleep sometimes at night, and it's a lot of demand to be on top of everything In the beginning, I remember I would actually look up and in the beginning when I would talk about topics, I'd actually look up experts and refer to quotes from Murray Sinclair, for example, or other well-known Indigenous people to highlight certain of my points. It's like a well-written paper, but in 30 seconds or less, quickly. And then the other thing I learned to do, ask me your question in writing, because I'll write it really quickly, and it reduced inaccuracy of how I'm being reported on.
When journalists are looking for someone to quote or speak to, it is reasonable to think they could just as easily look to people who simply are well educated and informed about the issue and can speak about it, rather than being the foremost expert, and that it will be easier to find women and racially marginalized people when journalists do not rely on traditional ways of sourcing experts. We need to be more intentional with interviewing people with broader life experiences and more diverse backgrounds. The more we do that, the clearer the story will be. Key takeaways. When reporting on gender equality, link it with issues of employment, the economy, politics, climate change, or other broad societal issues that are not typically considered women's issues. Consider how issues impact women and other equity-deserving groups differently than or disproportionately to how they impact men. Learn about existing gender biases in crime reporting, which reveals the harsher treatment of women perpetrators and also the greater social tolerance for crimes against women. Be intentional about building out rosters of experts and contacts who come from a variety of diverse groups. When you've done that, be sure to speak to them about a range of issues and not only as representatives of groups with which they identify. If institutions are frequently giving contact information for cisgender, heterosexual white men, ask them if they can recommend someone from an equity-deserving group. If they can't, ask the men you're speaking with if they have colleagues they recommend.